The history of warfare is replete with stories of commanders outrunning their supplies. Longstreet in the fall of 1863 is just one example. With Braxton Bragg in the west and Lee in the east, Lawton had his hands full trying to supply both armies. The plan to reinforce Bragg with Longstreet was a good one, and part of that force helped win the day at Chickamauga. But instead of consolidating their forces in the west, in Chattanooga, Longstreet impetuously elected to march against Burnside's in Knoxville. With winter setting in, Longstreet was sitting at the end of a 1,000-mile, if I may serve up a pun, long street. There was no local sources of supply for the siege. The army besieged Burnside's was far better equipped than Longstreet's command doing the besieging. Shoes and clothing ran low, and scavenging for footgear produced almost nothing in eastern Tennessee. Like the Revolutionary War, once again, soldiers left bloody footprints in the snow. Frequently, rations were only raw corn, normally used for animal fodder. Now the blame game shifted into high gear. Lawton did manage to ship some supplies to Longstreet, but nowhere near enough. Jefferson Davis called on Lawton for a full report. Lawton blamed Lee for stripping the Richmond depot. He said he expected imports to fill the need for shoes and blankets, but these never came. Most of these imports were interdicted off the port of Wilmington. Finally, Lawton claimed that Longstreet's requests were of a more extravagant character. Lawton believed that one-third of the requests would have been adequate. At this critical time, Governor Zebulon Vance saved Longstreet's bacon by opening up state supplies. During the winter, Lee demanded the return of Longstreet. One suspects Lee did this not so much to relieve Longstreet's logistical problems, but to enhance the Army of Northern Virginia. The Confederacy was slow to see the logistical prospects before her. There were three ways to supply the Army: make the items yourself, buy the items abroad, or scavenge the goods from your own lands, or better, from the enemy. Like so many countries before and since, the leaders expected a short war. As we will document shortly, the South was in pretty good shape at the beginning of the war. Very few people expected the new country would have to do any of the three. As we have already noted, the production and distribution capabilities of the Confederacy were modest in the extreme. Gorgas was one of the few far-sighted individuals who foresaw the need to construct a manufacturing base sufficient to supply a long war. Further, Gorgas was a master at delegating to achieve his goals. As early as July 1861, he had selected George Washington Rains to develop the capability to manufacture powder. Rains, too, was a genius at organization. He quickly contracted with existing plants to get early supplies flowing. For example, the Sycamore Powder Mill outside of Nashville contributed modest amounts of saltpeter. Rains started into enlarging that operation such that the output was doubled to 1,500 pounds per day by October, and doubled again to 3,000 pounds before Nashville fell in February of 1862. A successful search for nitrate of lime was conducted in the limestone caves of the Deep South. In Gorgas's mind, the issue of centralization versus decentralization was always churning. Early on, he recognized the efficiency of centralization in production of just a few large plants. Three things mitigated against this. First, he early on recognized the inadequate railroad distribution system. Next, he well understood that in war, you cannot put all your eggs in one basket. The fall of Nashville, noted above, is a good illustration of the wisdom of such reasoning. And finally, getting labor, supplies of materials, and building large plants was beyond the capabilities of the Confederacy. Therefore, once he had at least one source of domestic supply, he went on to build up other manufacturing centers. Often the first site was Richmond, Virginia, and the second one was somewhere in the deep South like Georgia. Later on, we will discuss the strengths and weaknesses of Southern factories. Gorgas was on top of imports from Europe very early on, in spite of the fact that he did not have any official authority to conduct foreign affairs. Early in 1861, he recommended the government dispatch an agent to purchase foreign arms and ammunition. Major Caleb House was his guy on the continent. Supplied only with letters of credit on the English import-export banking firm of Fraser, Trenholm, and Company, House, for all of his later troubles, proved a great move for the new nation. All of this got started with the ridiculous sum of £10,000. Once contracts had been established, the arms had to be transported. Gorgas arranged slow sea passage from to Bermuda or the Bahamas, where they were transshipped into his ordnance warehouses to await fast transport on blockade runners. By early 1863, Gorgas received authority to manage sea transportation for the government. It was easy for the bickering officials in Richmond just to let Josiah do it. De facto, he became the logistics general-in-chief. Things did not always go smoothly for him. In a minute, we will discuss the rise and fall of blockade running, but he clearly was a man of action, and he got things done. The last point is the process of scavenging. When you are in a supply deficit, it is getting stuff from the enemy that is useful, as Nathan Bedford Forrest put it. However, the South was slow to pick up on this strategy. Early in the war, they had plenty and did not think the war would last too long. Evidence of this was the lack of policing the Bull Run battlefield. But as it became clear that stuff from the enemy was valuable, the South became expert raiders. The cavalry became particularly adept at this. Ocean raiders did not bring much stuff home, but caused the price of insurance to skyrocket in the North to aid the war effort. Scavenging meant also taking what is needed from your own domestic supplies. As we will learn later, critical metals were obtained by cannibalizing finished goods, and citizens of the CSA were expected to chip in their valuables, such as food, clothing, and shelter, for the war effort. In this war, like no other before it, everyone was considered in combat and on the front lines, whether they liked it or not. Much of the early optimism about the Second American Revolution came from a straightforward analysis of what the South had at the start and underestimation of the will of the North. They had a larger standing army ready for war when hostilities broke out. In addition, the officer corps was larger and acknowledged to be better. And the Confederate States of America was no third world banana republic. It was the fourth richest country in the world. It had a well-supplied arsenal thanks to all of the federal installations within its borders, and these plums had fallen like ripe fruit even before the fighting got started. When Virginia seceded in April of 1861, the U.S. garrison attempted to burn the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and destroy the machinery to prevent the Confederates from using it. However, locals saved the equipment, which the Confederate Army transferred to a more secure location in its capital, Richmond. Of particular note is the action of Secretary of War John Floyd, who, before the war even got started, transferred tons of supplies either into Southern installations or placed in a position where they could easily be seized. Floyd was not the only one, but he certainly had the greatest positive effect on Confederate logistics early on.